3:47 in the morning. The code alarm screamed through Mercer General like a thing alive, and Margaret Walsh was already moving. She didn't run. Running made noise. Running showed panic. She walked, fast and steady, her left leg compensating with the muscle memory of 18 years, and pushed through the crash cart bay door into Trauma Room 2, where a patient lay exsanguinating into the sterile field and 3 resident physicians stood frozen like sculptures. The patient's chest was open, not surgical, not clean. A traffic accident. T-bone collision on I-40. Penetrating trauma to the right anterior chest, and the blood was spilling like the boy couldn't hold it anymore, couldn't hold anything. His name was Mitchell. 23 years old. Construction worker. No one knew yet that he would die without intervention in the next 90 seconds. Margaret didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She reached past Dr. Chen, the trauma attending, and grabbed the MRE package from the tray, retted, torn, the cardboard breakfast case from someone's morning rations. She'd seen this before. She'd done this before. Not at Mercer General. Somewhere else. Somewhere hot. Somewhere the helicopters came at dusk. Her hands moved on their own. Training took over the moment the fingers registered the wound depth, the rate of air escape, the slick pressure against the ribs. 12 seconds. She opened the MRE packaging with the precision of someone who'd practiced in darkness, who'd practiced while rounds were coming through canvas walls. The plastic lining came free. She pressed it against the sucking chest wound. The hiss stopped. The air that had been escaping stopped escaping. The patient's blood pressure began its climb. 100. 98. 102. The residents watched. One of them, Dr. Curtis, fresh from Johns Hopkins, opened her mouth as if remembering she was supposed to say something, but the words died before they reached her lips. The attending, Dr. Chen, didn't look at Margaret. Didn't ask how she knew. Just nodded once and stepped aside. 14-gauge angiocath. 2 units of O negative, running wide open. His voice was steady, but something in the room had changed. The temperature. The pressure. Someone had just done something that didn't match the badge clipped to her scrub pocket that said Margaret Walsh, RN. Margaret stepped back. Hands down. Eyes forward. The part where you become invisible again. She'd been invisible at Mercer General for 3 years. The other night shift nurses, younger ones, mostly, with student loans and social media accounts and plans to move to the trauma centers in Chapel Hill or Duke, would ask her questions about difficult patients. They'd ask her about medication interactions or cardiac rhythms or the fastest way to place a central line when the veins had all collapsed. Then their shifts would end and they'd go somewhere together, and Margaret would clock out and drive to the apartment on Magnolia Street where the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. 3 years of steady hands. 3 years of knowing without being told. 3 years of the quietest competence the night shift had ever seen. She clocked out at 7:15 a.m., her badge hanging from the lanyard that had become almost invisible with wear. The morning shift was arriving. Boots clicking on the tile floor. Voices carrying the bright energy of people who still believed in their own importance. Margaret passed them in the stairwell without looking up. The night had been 17 hours. 18 if you counted the time she'd stayed after her shift ended to sit beside the patient in 317, the mute veteran whose name was James Keller, whose throat had been scarred in a way that suggested violence rather than surgery, whose eyes tracked her with a kind of desperate recognition that made the other nurses uncomfortable. She'd noticed that. The discomfort. The way they'd glance at James and then at Margaret and then away, as if they were watching something private they weren't meant to see. James had arrived 3 days ago from the VA hospital in Durham, transferred for a procedure they still hadn't done because his anxiety attacks kept spiking the moment anyone approached with equipment he didn't recognize. He'd been thrashing. Tearing at his fall lines. Making a sound in the back of his throat like something broken. Until Margaret came in. She'd pulled a chair to the side of his bed at 11:27 p.m. on a Tuesday, when the ward was dark except for the ambient glow of monitors and the exit signs painting everything green. She didn't speak. Didn't touch him. Just sat there while his breathing slowed, while his hands unclenched from the bed rails, while his eyes that had seen things, found hers and held. "It's going to be okay," she'd said. Quiet. Almost conversational. "I know what panic feels like. I know what it feels like when your body thinks it's still there." She'd pulled her jacket tighter without thinking about it. The edge of fabric had shifted. For just a moment, James's eyes had tracked the movement. For just a moment, his body language had changed. Not relaxing. Recognizing. And that was the moment Dr. Mercer had appeared in the doorway. Margaret hadn't seen him at first. She'd only heard the subtle intake of breath, the quick mental recalculation that good administrators always made when they walked in on something that didn't fit their operational framework. Dr. Mercer was 58, with the kind of silver-threaded hair that required an expensive barber, and the kind of smile that had closed hospital wings without mercy. He'd been Mercy General's chief of medicine for 2 years, and in that time he'd consolidated power the way generals consolidated territory, through strategic alignment and the understanding that information was more valuable than kindness. He was watching Margaret. She felt it the way animals feel predators. Not with fear. With recognition. "Ms. Walsh," he said. Not a question. A statement. The kind of statement a man made when he'd already decided something. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd learned a long time ago that flinching showed weakness. She'd learned it in a place where weakness got people killed. She simply stood, smoothed her jacket, and left the room without acknowledging him. But she'd adjusted the fabric as she moved. She'd covered what he'd seen. The faded unit patch, so faded now that the colors had merged into a kind of bruised purple, the edges stitched with thread that had loosened and loosened again over years and years. The stitching was meticulous. The kind of stitching someone did when they had nothing but time and the need to keep their hands from shaking. She'd sewn it into the jacket lining herself, 6 months into her second tour, when the thought of returning to regular life had made her chest feel like it was collapsing. The patch had been cut from a rucksack that belonged to someone named Sergeant Timothy Halloway, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. He'd been 21 years old when an IED made that question permanent. She'd kept the patch because keeping it felt like it meant something. Keeping it felt like keeping faith. But Mercer had seen it. Mercer had seen the way James's eyes had changed when she adjusted it. Mercer had seen something in that moment that made his expression sharpen and harden, the way a predator's expression hardens when it's identified prey. Margaret clocked out and drove home through the Raleigh morning, watching the sky lighten from charcoal to grey to something approaching blue. The radio was off. The silence was perfect. She'd learned to prefer silence. Silence was honest. Silence didn't make promises. She didn't know that Mercer had already begun his calculation. She didn't know that he was checking the employment records, looking for gaps, looking for periods of time that didn't match the resume. She didn't know that he was going to spend the rest of the day making phone calls to people she didn't remember and asking questions she couldn't answer. All Margaret knew was that something had shifted. Something in the way Mercer had looked at her. Something in the recognition that had flashed across James's scarred face. The next words out of Mercer's mouth would change everything. The memo arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and official, printed on hospital letterhead and distributed to every administrator with a CC line that read like a hit list. Margaret didn't see it firsthand. She heard about it from Torres, the IT specialist who'd noticed her name flagged in 3 different department emails before 8 a.m. Optimization protocols, he'd said, handing her a printed copy during her break. Translation, he's building a case. The words were clinical. Professional. Merciless. Patient care optimization protocols require reassignment of non-specialty staff from ICU observation roles. Nursing supervisor Margaret Walsh will transition to pediatric floor effective immediately to better utilize her generalist credentials. No mention of her 3 years of perfect evaluations. No mention of the veteran in room 317 who hadn't eaten a full meal since she'd been moved. Just optimization. Just protocols. Just a memo that felt like a blade sliding between ribs. But that wasn't the worst part. Mercer had scheduled her reassignment for mid-shift, which meant she'd walk out of the ICU and straight into pediatrics without warning. Without time to say goodbye to the veteran. Without time for him to understand why the only person he'd learned to trust was suddenly gone. Margaret realized this on Wednesday evening when she found the schedule update posted on the nursing portal. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She simply read it twice, committed it to memory with the same precise focus she'd once used to memorize map coordinates in Kandahar, and went back to her work. The next morning arrived grey and thick with humidity. Margaret clocked in at 6:38 a.m., took report on the ICU floor, and made her rounds with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that each gesture might be her last in that space. In room 317, the veteran was awake, his eyes tracking her the way they always did, desperate recognition, the kind that came from being seen by someone who understood the shape of trauma without needing words. His wife was there, sitting in the visitor's chair with coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His adult son stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the city wake up. At 10:14 a.m., during shift change, Dr. Mercer walked into the room like he owned it. Margaret was adjusting the fall line, her movements economical and practiced. The sound of the monitors filled the silence, steady beep, steady rhythm, the sound of someone still in the fight. Mercer didn't knock. Didn't acknowledge anyone. He looked directly at Margaret with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes and spoke loud enough for the entire floor to hear through the open door. "Nurse Walsh," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who'd learned that humiliation worked best when it had witnesses. "Your shift ended 2 hours ago. Or does the concept of boundaries escape you?" Margaret's hand stilled on the fall line. She turned slowly, her face an empty canvas. The veteran's wife looked up, uncomfortable. His son straightened, suddenly alert to the kind of aggression that moved through hospital corridors with impunity. Mercer continued, his tone darkening into something almost playful. "I'm sure our Florence Nightingale here thinks rules don't apply to her special touch. That some patients warrant special arrangements." "Is there a problem, doctor?" the son asked. His voice had the controlled edge of someone used to handling difficult men. Mercer smiled thinly, like a wolf showing its teeth before it tests the fence. "No problem at all. Just our night owl here doesn't understand when she's not wanted." He turned back to Margaret, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man holding power and using it precisely. "Your reassignment to pediatrics begins today. Effective immediately. You'll orient with Charge Nurse Patterson at 11 a.m. Margaret stood perfectly still. She held his gaze with a stare so flat, so devoid of anything he could work with, that she saw the smallest flicker of irritation cross his face. Then she looked at the veteran, whose hands had begun moving frantically, gestures she recognized from weeks of careful attention. Panic. Abandonment. The particular terror of being left behind by the only guide you trusted. She turned back to Mercer and her voice came out low, controlled, the kind of calm that sits on top of absolute certainty. "He was having a flashback," she said simply. "You wouldn't recognize one." Then she walked past him, her scrubs whispering softly against the doorframe, and she didn't look back even when she heard the veteran's wife ask questions that would go unanswered. The sound of his hand signing desperately would stay with her for weeks, that frantic percussion of someone trying to communicate with people who spoke an entirely different language. The break room was her sanctuary between the ICU and pediatrics, a small windowless space with a microwave that smelled perpetually of fish and a refrigerator humming like a failing engine. Margaret sat at the corner table with a sandwich she didn't want and a coffee she'd poured out of habit rather than need. 6 other nurses were clustered around the central table, their conversation a low murmur of shift gossip and schedule complaints. The moment she pulled out her chair, something shifted. It was subtle, the way predators sense weakness in prey. One of the younger nurses, someone named Katie who'd always been cordial enough, suddenly remembered an urgent chart to check. Another gasped and said she'd forgotten her medication from her locker. Within 30 seconds, the table had scattered like they were fleeing contamination. Within 90 seconds, Margaret was alone in the break room with the hum of the refrigerator and the taste of her sandwich like cardboard in her mouth. She didn't move. Didn't acknowledge the exodus. She simply sat and stared at the wall, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone lukewarm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in a jar. Nobody came back to that corner of the break room for the rest of her shift. By the following Monday, Dr. Mercer had escalated his campaign beyond humiliation into something that left paper trails. A formal memo to the nursing director citing concerns about patient boundaries and professional conduct. A note in the veteran's chart documenting his non-compliance with medications administered by assigned nursing staff, which was technically true only if you didn't understand that the veteran refused meds from anyone except Margaret because no one else tried to communicate with him like he was still a person. A formal disciplinary write-up that appeared on the main unit board, right by the nurses' station where everyone passed during shift change, printed in black ink on official hospital letterhead. The notice read, "Written warning, Margaret Walsh. Unauthorized patient contact outside assigned duties. Failure to follow chain of command. Boundary violations with patient in room 317. Further incidents will result in immediate termination." Margaret read it slowly, standing in front of the bulletin board while conversations around her dropped into whispers. Nurses passed, eyes sliding away from her face. Someone had already seen it, everyone would know within the hour. She traced the words with her eyes, committing them to memory the way she'd learned to commit other things, safe houses, threat patterns, the faces of people who'd try to kill her. Then she turned, moving with a deliberate slowness that made the air around her feel heavy, and walked directly toward Mercer's office. He was sitting at his desk, papers spread in front of him, the picture of administrative competence. He looked up, and she saw the moment he registered what was about to happen, the way his hand tightened on his pen, the way his breathing changed. Margaret stepped into his office and closed the door behind her. They were alone. Just the two of them and the terrible clarity of what he'd been trying to do. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the apologetic deferential nurse he'd been trying to bully. This voice came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had held itself together through things he'd never even imagined. "You're terrified of what he might say when he remembers how to." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't threaten. Didn't need to. The words landed like a blade finding the gap between ribs, and she saw the color drain from his face. Saw his jaw go tight. Saw him understand, for just a moment, that he'd miscalculated something fundamental. Then Margaret turned and walked away, her footsteps steady on the tile floor, leaving him pale under the fluorescent lights with nothing but silence and the knowledge that he'd made a mistake the size of Kandahar. That night, Mercer pulled the veteran's medical file and began documenting everything. Not for medical reasons. For legal ones. He wrote detailed notes about concerning behavioral patterns, patient instability, and risks associated with specialized nursing arrangements. Each entry was timed and dated, building a paper fortress around the decision he'd already made. The veteran would be transferred out of room 317, or Margaret would be gone, or both. What he didn't know was that Torres had been watching the security footage. The same Torres whose grandfather had died in a VA hospital with no one to advocate for him. The Marine Corps IT specialist had backup files that would tell a very different story than the one Mercer was constructing. The termination paperwork arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in a manila envelope with her name typed in the subject line. Margaret didn't open it at home. She read the letter at her kitchen table at 5:22 a.m., the fluorescent clock on the wall ticking like a countdown, the words blurring as she scanned the charges: unauthorized patient contact, failure to follow chain of command, insubordination, gross negligence in clinical judgment. Dr. Mercer's signature was notarized. The date was 3 days old. She'd been fired on a Friday and nobody had bothered to tell her until now, letting her walk into that hospital 4 times thinking she still had a job, still had the only thing left to lose. The envelope said final paycheck, HR processing, collect by end of business Tuesday or it would be mailed. Margaret, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a grey sweater, the kind of thing nobody noticed, and drove to Mercy General at 6:15 a.m., when the lobby was empty except for the overnight security guard and a janitor pushing a mop that squeaked like a dying animal with each stroke across the tile. She didn't take the elevator. She'd learned years ago to avoid being trapped in small spaces when your heart was learning how to break again. The HR office was on the second floor, accessible by the stairs that wound up behind the radiology department, and she was thinking about direct deposit, about whether they'd already closed her account, when the intercom crackled overhead. Code Blue, ICU, Room 317. Code Blue, ICU, Room 317. The room number hit like a physical thing. Room 317. The veteran's room. Margaret's feet stopped moving. Her lungs did that thing they did sometimes, compress suddenly, as if someone had wrapped steel bands around her ribs and pulled. Room 317. The mute veteran. The man whose eyes had tracked her the way a drowning person tracks a hand reaching into dark water. She told herself to keep walking. To get the check. To leave this place and never come back, to let whatever happened in that room be someone else's problem, someone else's failure. That was the smart play. That was the play that kept you alive when you'd already lost everything. But her legs were already turning back toward the stairwell, already moving faster, and her mind was calculating distances like it always did. Basement to ICU was for floors, the staff stairs were closer than the main elevator. She could make the room in 90 seconds if she didn't stop. The ICU corridor smelled like sweat and antiseptic and something else, something underneath it all that smelled like fear, sharp and metallic, like copper pennies soaking in vinegar. The crash cart was already inside 317, the team assembled around the bed like priests around an altar, and Margaret could see the problem before she even reached the window. The resident was fumbling with the laryngoscope, trying to thread an endotracheal tube past the scarring, and the veteran's throat, that ruined landscape of Kandahar shrapnel and surgical reconstruction, was telling a story that nobody in this room could read. The resident tried again. Coughing. Gagging. The tube wouldn't seat properly. The monitor showed the damage, oxygen saturation at 88% and dropping, falling like a stone down a well, 85, 82, 79. The attending was shouting for a surgical airway kit, for a trach set, his voice climbing toward panic, and Margaret could see on his face the exact moment he realized he didn't know how to manage this patient because nobody had bothered to brief them. Nobody had told them the scarring was combat-related. Nobody had told them anything. The wife was in the hallway, screaming. "Do something. Do something, he's dying, why aren't you doing anything?" Her voice was breaking like bone, fracturing with each word, and a nurse, one of the younger ones, the ones who never spoke to Margaret anymore, was trying to guide her away, but she was pulling back, fighting to see into the room, fighting to will her husband's lungs to work through the shattered landscape of his throat. 78. 76. The second hand on the wall clock was moving too fast. Every second without adequate oxygenation was damage that wouldn't come back. Brain cells dying in clusters, in waves, in the kind of cascade that started with confusion and ended with a person you loved becoming a stranger wearing your husband's face. Margaret's badge wouldn't scan at the ICU entrance. The red light. The buzzer that meant denied. She moved past the reader without hesitating and took the stairs two at a time, the kind of movement that belonged to someone who'd practiced exfil drills in desert compounds at 2 in the morning. The stairwell door swung open and she was in the ICU hallway just as Dr. Mercer came around the corner from the opposite direction, his face already flushed with the satisfaction of knowing he'd won. He'd kept her off this floor. He'd made sure she couldn't help. He'd done his job so thoroughly that the man in room 317 was going to die because nobody understood how to save him. Mercer saw her. His expression shifted, the flash deepening, the eyes widening just a fraction, a microscopic tell that said he understood exactly what she was doing and what was about to happen. "Security," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. "Get her out of here." The wife grabbed Margaret's arm as she passed. She didn't ask. She just grabbed, the way a person grabs at anything solid when the world is drowning them. "You helped him before. You helped him before, please, please help him. Margaret's eyes met hers for exactly 1 second. He's going to be fine, she said, and she meant it with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt, the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who has already decided what happens next. The attending looked up as Margaret moved past Mercer, and something shifted in his face, recognition or maybe just relief, the way a drowning man reacts when he finally sees the boat. Mercer grabbed her arm. She didn't slow down. You're not cleared. You're fired. You have no authority here. 72, she said, not turning back, not looking at him, just reading the monitor. We're down to 72, Doctor. You want to keep talking? The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hissing, could hear the wife sobbing in the doorway, could hear the monitors beeping their death song in that particular rhythm that meant the body was beginning to fail. Margaret moved to the crash cart, her hands moving with the kind of autonomy that came from muscle memory, from 3 tours in Kandahar, from all those nights she'd sewn together soldiers who should have already been dead. The attending stepped back without being told. That was the thing about competence, it spoke a language that didn't require words. The resident was still holding the laryngoscope, frozen. Margaret saw it and saw him, really saw him, a kid maybe 5 years out of med school, trained in textbook anatomy, never trained in a particular way that combat trauma rewrite the human body's basic architecture. Move, she said. He moved. The alarm shrieked. Margaret moved without thinking, her body already in motion before her mind caught up. She shouldered past a resident who was fumbling with intubation equipment, her hands already reaching for the crash cart. The younger doctors parted like water. They didn't recognize what they were seeing, muscle memory written in flesh and bone, precision earned in desert firefights where hesitation meant body bags. Room 317. The veteran's airway was scarred tissue over scarred tissue. The standard endotracheal tube would never fit. The attending was repositioning the blade for a 4th attempt, sweat beading on his forehead, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, 89, 87, 84. The monitor's rhythm was becoming erratic. The man's wife stood frozen in the corner, understanding without words that her husband was dying in front of her. Margaret grabbed a ballpoint pen from the crash cart. Snapped it clean. Removed the ink tube with the precision of someone who'd done this before, not in a hospital, but in a mud-walled compound outside Kandahar city, with incoming fire raking the walls and a Marine with a crushed larynx drowning in his own blood. She tore open a plastic breakfast tray someone had left on the bedside table, the waffle packaging, rigid plastic, sterile. 30 seconds. Her hands moved like she was operating a machine that had memorized every movement. Needle decompression first. 14-gauge angiocath through the cricothyroid membrane. One swift motion. Air hissed, the sound of an airway opening, desperate and raw. She threaded the plastic casing as a makeshift airway tube, securing it with tape she grabbed off a supply cart without asking permission. Bag him, Margaret said. 8 breaths per minute. Don't hyperventilate him. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the soft, deferential tone of a night shift nurse anymore. This was command. Authority that made the attending step back instinctively, his hands dropping to his sides like he'd been relieved of duty. Because in that moment, he had been. She was monitoring his chest rise now, her palm flat on the veteran's sternum feeling for the compliance, the give of lungs accepting air. The monitors began climbing. Oxygen saturation, 88. The beeping accelerated. 91, the rhythm steadying. 94, she was calling out numbers now, her hands working with the fluid certainty of someone who'd been doing this at a trauma level no American hospital would ever see. Prepare proper intubation. Size 4.0 tube. Get me a flexible scope. Nurses moved without question. The crash team reorganized itself around her like planets orbiting the sun. The veteran's color was returning, gray to pink to something approaching alive. His wife made a sound like prayer and disbelief combined. O2 sat hit 96. The monitor's singing steady rhythm. Sinus. Beautiful, perfect sinus rhythm. Margaret stepped back. Breathed. Her scrubs were bloodstained from the 4 pushes and the needlework. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was the thing about combat medicine, the trembling never happened during the save. It only happened afterward, when you had time to understand how close you'd come to losing. The attending approached her, confusion and gratitude warring across his face. "I don't know how you." "He's stable." Margaret didn't acknowledge the compliment. She was already turning away, checking the monitors one final time, making sure the plastic airway would hold long enough for a surgical team to place a proper tracheostomy. Everything was dialed in. Everything was under control. That's when Dr. Mercer arrived. He appeared in the doorway with the attending physician trailing behind him, probably summoned to report on the code. His face registered what had happened in one glance: the improvised airway, the unauthorized procedures, the fact that a fired nurse had just saved a patient he'd been watching die. His jaw tightened. A flush crept up his neck, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually thank her. Instead, she watched his face transition through stages of emotion like watching a man descend into a basement. The flush deepened. His hands clenched. His eyes found hers and held them with pure, undiluted rage. He pulled out his phone. Margaret knew what was coming. She'd been in enough military courts-martial to recognize the machinery of institutional power being set in motion. The wheels didn't spin fast in a hospital, but they ground with the same finality as they did in the JG office. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, Dr. Mercer had filed a formal incident report detailing Margaret's unauthorized patient contact. By 3:15, an assault complaint had been notarized, claiming she'd made aggressive physical contact with him in the hallway, which was technically true, though the context of saving a man's life seemed relevant. By 4:27, he'd invoked a North Carolina state regulation prohibiting medical procedures by terminated employees, a statute designed to prevent exactly this kind of improvisation. Each form was meticulously dated, notarized, and copied to the hospital board, the legal department, risk management, and one more recipient that made Margaret's stomach go cold when she saw the address, her parole officer at the VA. Because Mercer had found that record too. He dug deep enough to pull her discharge paperwork, the conditions of her separation, the notation that she was required to complete mandatory post-traumatic stress evaluation before her medical discharge could be finalized. Security arrived at 5:15 p.m. They were polite about it, 2 men who'd worked the ER long enough to know Margaret wasn't a threat, but the message was the same. She was to vacate the premises immediately. No access to patient floors. No contact with hospital staff. The grounds. The veteran was still sedated when she left. His wife tried to follow her into the hallway, gratitude and confusion mingling on her face, but Mercer intercepted her at the door. Margaret heard him. "That woman is no longer affiliated with this hospital and legally cannot have patient contact." His voice was pleasant. Professional. The kind of tone that made cruelty sound like protocol. 2 days later, Margaret sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital in Durham, 40 miles from Raleigh, surrounded by men and women in various stages of healing. A woman missing her right arm. A man whose hand shook so badly he couldn't hold his coffee. A young Marine with eyes that hadn't yet learned how to see the world as anything other than a battlefield. They were veterans, like her. Broken, like her. Starting over, like her. And she realized, sitting in that plastic chair under fluorescent lights that hummed like they were dying, that she'd lost the only identity she'd managed to build after her body had failed her. The gunnery sergeant was gone, buried under a discharge certificate and medical restrictions. She'd tried to become Margaret Walsh, quiet nurse, competent nurse, invisible nurse. That was gone too now. The night shift nurse who'd saved a patient's life had become the unauthorized medical practitioner who'd assaulted her supervisor. She stared at her hands. They weren't shaking. They never shook. But they were empty now in a way that had nothing to do with whether she was holding something. These were hands that had held lives together in the dark. Hands that had learned to work miracles with materials that weren't supposed to be miracles. Hands that remembered Kandahar so clearly that sometimes she could smell the dust, feel the concussion of the mortars through the earth beneath her feet. A voice called her name for her evaluation. She stood and followed the VA therapist into a small office with a desk and 2 chairs and a window overlooking a parking lot. The woman smiled warmly. Margaret recognized the smile. It was the smile people gave to broken things. The smile that meant, "I understand you're damaged, and I'm here to help you accept your damage." But before Margaret could sit down, her phone vibrated. And then again. And again. She almost ignored it. The evaluation was mandatory. She needed to complete it. She needed to maintain compliance with her discharge conditions, needed to keep the structure of her new life intact even though that structure had just collapsed like a building with its support columns removed. She opened the text anyway. The message came from a number she didn't recognize. Just coordinates and a timestamp, 11:38 a.m., Thursday. That was 14 minutes from now. Margaret looked up at the therapist. "I need to reschedule," she said quietly. "Something's come up." The woman's smile faltered. "Ms. Walsh, this is a mandatory evaluation." But Margaret was already walking toward the door, and there was something in her movement, some quality of purpose that made the therapist stop talking. The door opened, and Margaret went back into the hallway, back through the waiting room past all those wounded people who understood without being told that some calls couldn't be ignored. She drove back to Raleigh in silence. No music. No radio. Just the sound of her heartbeat and the engine and something deeper than sound, a frequency that only certain people could hear. The frequency of being called back into service. Mercy General appeared like a memory made solid. The parking lot. The main entrance. The security desk. She walked past security before they could process who she was, and they didn't stop her because she moved like she had every right to be there. She moved like she belonged. And somewhere inside the building, in a patient room on the 3rd floor, something was about to change. Thursday arrived like a reckoning. The operators moved through Mercy General's main entrance at 11:02 a.m., 4 of them, the kind of men who walk into hospitals the same way they'd walk into compounds, boots hitting the polished floors with military precision, their presence alone making the air pressure change. No dress uniforms. No ceremony. Just tactical pants, fitted black shirts, and the unmistakable bearing of people who'd spent years expecting contact. They didn't sign in at the security desk. Torres, the IT specialist who'd been standing by the conference room, simply nodded them through. The head operator was Colonel Hayes. His face carried the architecture of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives and lived with that weight. Behind him came a chaplain in navy dress blues, a second colonel whose name tag read Sterling, and finally, a general, 2 stars on her collar, her silver hair pulled back tight, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been to every funeral. They moved toward the ICU without hesitation. They knew where they were going. The mute veteran was sitting up. The ventilator had been removed 3 days prior, and what remained was a man learning how to breathe on his own, how to exist without the mechanical rhythm that had kept him alive. His eyes tracked the operators as they entered, tracked them with the precision of someone who'd been trained to read threats and allies in the space of a heartbeat. Then his eyes found Margaret. She was standing by the billing office, 3 doors down the corridor, updating patient charts on the wall-mounted screen. Her scrubs were the same ones she'd worn for 6 months, faded blue, worn soft from too many shifts, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone doing double duty. She was different now. The timidity was gone. The deference had evaporated. What remained was something harder to classify, something that moved through the hospital like a current. The veteran's ruined voice forced out a single word. Rasping. Broken. But unmistakable. Valkyrie. It took Margaret 0.3 seconds to recognize it. Her hand stilled on the screen. Her shoulders didn't tense, but her breathing shifted, a deliberate control, the kind of breath discipline that comes from learning to remain steady when everything around you is burning. The operators turned. The hospital administrator had called an emergency meeting for 12:15 p.m. in the main conference room, but it became immediately clear that the real meeting was happening in the hallway. The general approached Margaret the way you'd approach a fallen soldier, with precision and respect. The chaplain moved toward the veterans' room. The two colonels remained in position, their posture suggesting they'd done this before, held ground while others made decisions. The conference room filled anyway. Board members arrived. Legal counsel. Nursing administration. The hospital's legal team, sensing blood in the water, brought laptops and notepads. Dr. Mercer was called to the meeting at 12:31 p.m. He arrived confident. Actually confident. His folder under his arm contained documentation going back for months, every write-up he'd filed, every complaint, every photograph of Margaret allegedly violating protocols, every signature he'd collected from staff members he'd pressured into compliance. He'd prepared for this conversation. He'd rehearsed it. He'd anticipated the questions and constructed his responses with the care of a surgeon preparing for a complex procedure. He began before anyone invited him to speak. The tone was clinical. Detached. This woman violated multiple hospital policies, ignored chain of command, performed unauthorized procedures that could have resulted in patient harm, and has demonstrated a clear pattern of insubordination across her tenure here. Colonel Hayes cut him off mid-sentence. You mean she saved a patient's life while your team stood there failing? The words landed like a defibrillator shock. The room contracted. Mercer's mouth opened. The folder wavered. I have documentation. I'm sure you do, Hayes said. His voice was measured. The kind of measured that makes men re-evaluate every decision they've made in the last 6 months. Tell me, Dr. Mercer, when did you first know about the patient's observation? Mercer's face began to shift color. Anger flickering toward confusion, flickering toward something darker. Fear. I don't, that's not relevant to the medication cabinet, Hayes continued. Security footage shows you accessing it at 6:08 a.m. 3 pre-filled syringes. Then at 8:34 a.m., after Gunnery Sergeant Walsh saved your patient, you attempted to delete the timestamps from the security server. The folder slipped from Mercer's hands. Paper scattered across the polished conference table like white flags of surrender. Torres stood at that moment. The IT specialist moved to the head of the table, laptop in hand. He was Marine Corps, you could see it in the way he moved, the way he occupied space without apologizing for it. He set the laptop down and opened the security files. Standard protocol, Torres said quietly. When there's suspicious activity, I back up everything. Every frame. Every timestamp. Encrypted. Then I forward copies to federal agencies. He turned the laptop toward the room. The security footage played silently on the screen, Mercer's hand reaching into the medication cabinet, the syringes disappearing into his jacket pocket, then later, Mercer at the security terminal, typing rapidly, his face twisted with desperation. The medications he took, Torres continued, are controlled substances. The deletion attempt is evidence tampering. Everything's been forwarded to the DEA and criminal investigators. Mercer's voice cracked. Actually cracked. This is, you can't, I was trying to help. You were trying to kill a witness, Hayes said. He stood. His presence expanded to fill the room. That patient saw something. Something you didn't want him to remember. Something you didn't want anyone understanding. The veteran's wife provided a written statement from the hallway. Her husband had been trying to communicate for days, her handwriting careful and precise, that he'd seen Dr. Mercer diverting medications. But no one could read his signing. No one except Margaret. Mercer had first tried to discredit her. Then isolate the patient. Then when both failed, when the patient's condition had stabilized enough to potentially communicate what he'd witnessed, Mercer had acted. 3 controlled substances. Enough to stop a man's heart. Hospital legal counsel didn't deliberate. The decision came at 12:58 p.m. Termination, effective immediately. Pending criminal investigation. Security escorted Dr. Mercer from the conference room in front of the entire assembled staff, his badge confiscated before he reached the elevator. Margaret watched from the doorway. That same cold, flat stare. The one that had never wavered through humiliation or isolation or sabotage. As Mercer passed her, she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was more eloquent than speech. 6 months later, she returned to Mercy General wearing nursing scrubs. She walked the corridor toward room 317, where the veteran was doing his physical therapy, learning to speak again in something more than a whisper. His voice was hoarse now, scratched from the trauma of what had happened to his throat, but steady. Present. Alive because she'd understood what no one else could read, the desperation in his movements, the language of someone trapped inside a body that had been broken. The veteran's progress was visible. He could walk now. Could hold a conversation. Could tell jokes in that damaged voice and mean them. They passed the lobby security desk on the way out. Dr. Mercer was sitting there. A security company polo. Gray polyester. His name tag reading M. Mercer in black letters. He was checking badges, signing in visitors, performing the most junior task in the hospital, the position previously held by the elderly gentleman who'd retired 2 months prior, the position that would have been beneath someone of Mercer's perceived status. The position he now occupied from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week, at $15 an hour, with no benefits. His eyes flickered up as Margaret passed. Recognition occurred in the space of a heartbeat. His hands trembled slightly as he looked back down at his clipboard. The veteran noticed. He squeezed Margaret's shoulder as they walked. "You saved my life twice. Once in Kandahar. Once here." Margaret just nodded, kept moving. Her stride didn't change. Her pace didn't shift. But something in her bearing settled, the particular peace that comes from watching someone receive exactly what they've earned. In the ICU break room, the nurses pulled out a chair for her. Asked her advice on a complex case. The nurse who'd been coldest to her 6 months ago apologized quietly. "We should have known better. Should have asked." Margaret accepted it with the grace of someone who'd learned that forgiveness costs less than anger. She began teaching the younger nurses how to recognize combat-related PTSD in patients, how to read the signals that only someone trained in crisis would understand. She passed on everything she carried, the medical knowledge, the tactical awareness, the particular compassion that comes from knowing exactly how fragile human beings truly are. The final shift came to an end at 6:33 a.m. Margaret walked toward the parking lot as dawn broke pink and orange across the Raleigh skyline. She passed the lobby security desk one more time. Mercer was still sitting there, wearing that polo, watching visitors with eyes that had learned exactly what they'd lost. She didn't look at him. Didn't need to. He was exactly where he deserved to be. 6 months of back pay had been deposited to her account. Full benefits reinstated. A formal apology from the hospital board, though she'd never read it. Her nursing license was clean. Her reputation, among those who mattered, was something far more valuable than a reputation. It was legend. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you found Margaret's story as powerful as we did, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another reckoning. Like this video and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone in power who had no idea who they were standing next to? What would you have done in Margaret's position? Let's talk about it below.